When you are ready, you may begin. Please introduce your colleagues, and you have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Good afternoon, morning. I'm not sure what time it is, Mr. Chairperson.
You got 1 more minute, and then you can shift to afternoon. But
good morning.
No hurry.
Mr. Chairperson, Commissioners. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that this hearing is taking place on traditional unceded Algonquin territory. My name is Laura Tribe, and I am the Executive Director for OpenMedia, a community-based nonprofit organization that has been working to engage and amplify the voices of Canadians on internet policy issues for over a decade. I am joined here today by OpenMedia's Campaigns Director, Matt Hatfield, and Digital Rights Campaigner, Rodrigo Samayoa. I'm also happy to be testifying alongside Tamir Israel, staff lawyer at the Samuelson-Glushko Canadian Internet Policy and Public Interest Clinic, or CIPPIC. CIPPIC is a public interest legal clinic based at the University of Ottawa Faculty of Law. Unfortunately, the First Nations Technology Council wasn't able to join us here today as we had hoped. But they've asked us to emphasize that the challenges that we are here to outline today disproportionately affect Indigenous communities throughout Canada. Indigenous communities are not just lagging behind, they're often completely left out of the entire platform that our economy and society are built on. We'd ask you to consider what that means in a time of reconciliation and how the Commission's work can help address these disparities. Mobile services are at a crisis point. For far too long, excessively high prices have discouraged Canadians from realizing the full potential of their mobile devices. Some Canadians have been priced out of participating in the mobile data revolution altogether. In our submissions, we have proposed a 3-tiered response to Canada's wireless service challenges. The first, mandate full MVNO access on a cost recovery plus model. The second, mandate carriage of low-cost plans for all Canadians on national carriers' primary brands. And third, adopt in principle wholesale spectrum access on the basis of fair and reasonable rates. Our comments today focus on our community's needs, the benefits of mandating full and unrestricted MVNO access, and the Commission's role in making this happen. But we are happy to answer questions on our proposed remedies as well.
For years, OpenMedia's community has told us that mobile rates in Canada compare very poorly to what they see in other countries. We hear mobile costs are a significant burden on their finances and peace of mind, and when they try to make a change, they find they lack meaningful market choice. Study after study has confirmed these perceptions are grounded in fact. In this proceeding alone, over 18,000 OpenMedia community members submitted comments calling for MVNOs, while another 10,000 people took our survey providing more detailed insights on their wireless services. 85% of respondents to our survey indicated high prices are a serious impediment to their use of mobile services. And I'll quote, Margaret from Toronto said, quote, "I cannot afford to put a data plan on my phone. This used to be less problematic, but society has changed. Society, services, government, doctors expect one to have coverage and to be able to look up things and access information when out of the house. I cannot do it on my phone. It costs too much," end quote. 89% of the respondents indicated that there were not enough choice of providers. Byron from North Vancouver said, quote, "Personally, I live in dread fear of contacting my cell phone provider's customer service because the cell phone industry is so convoluted and restrictive in choice that I know I'll get bilked in one way or another. The cell phone companies have a monopoly in which they charge whatever they want. One would have to take a PhD in how to negotiate fair billing terms," end quote. And nearly half of our respondents indicated that restrictive data allotments also contribute to their challenges. Sean from Hamilton said, quote, "My cell phone plan is $80 a month. Data cap is 8 gigs. Last month, I had accidentally gone above the 8 gig threshold. The fee for end of the month billing at 10 gigs, 2 gigs over the limit, was over $500. Did I mention I need data for my day-to-day job?" End quote. Canadians are not fools. They know our wireless costs are incredibly high by international standards, a reality that slaps them in the face whenever they, their friends, or loved ones travel abroad. The recent emergence of plans branded as unlimited is an improvement, but only compared to where they're coming from. These unlimited, or rather throttled plans only appear cost-effective when compared to the anemic data allotments which have been the norm in Canada to date. As our submissions demonstrate, our eye-wateringly high retail prices cannot be attributed to high levels of investment. Even when adjusted for spectrum auctions, Canadian investment in mobile networks remain average when compared to our global peers, and low when compared to wireline. We also know that current competition levels aren't enough. The Competition Bureau's expert report to this proceeding found substantial price improvements following new market entrants in specific regions. And its expert report in the CRTC's 2014-76 proceeding examined wireless investment and pricing over decades and concluded that Canadian national providers continue to exercise market power on a national level. Full access to MVNOs will play a critical role in addressing this state of affairs.
MVNOs are innovative. They add diversity of mobile services and can help lower prices. In order to unleash the true potential of an MVNO landscape, full access must be mandated on a cost-plus basis. A full MVNO mandate facilitates innovation and service differentiation that better meets the needs of customers. For example, we heard on Wednesday that law enforcement would benefit from a cross-provider network robustness that an MVNO can provide. We've also heard from MVNOs who operate abroad that the secret to their success has been in excelling in customer service and in providing service to groups with special needs. In the UK, for example, Audacious provides an enhanced call clarity for individuals with hearing loss. We also heard in this proceeding from First Nations network operators who would offer mobile services in their communities if given the opportunity. Canada can benefit from this diversity in services. The Competition Bureau's expert report has indicated that an additional 5.5% market share for MVNOs in specific areas is sufficient pressure to begin to curb the national providers' market power. In aggregate, MVNOs can accrue 10 to 20% market share collectively. There are misconceptions that this form of competition can reduce investment. These are untrue. Investment will look different, but it won't be reduced. First, as we've mentioned, MVNOs frequently extend markets to niche demographics in ways that do not undercut the profits of MNOs, regional MNOs, or flanker brands. Second, it is important to note that national providers recover a healthy profit margin in a cost plus 15% wholesale margin. By contrast, an MVNO's retail prices will reflect its wholesale cost, its own operating cost, plus whatever margins it seeks to obtain. The fact that the MNOs are worried about competing in a market where they are guaranteed a 15% profit says much about the current state of our retail prices. The wholesale model is eminently suited for 5G. High-density last-mile infrastructure is already leading providers around the world and in Canada to rely heavily on network sharing as a means of efficient infrastructure investment. Regional MNOs may become 5G leaders in their own regions, while leveraging their hybrid status to compete with MVNOs nationally. It is also possible that the larger MVNOs may choose to build on its own customer base by investing in facilities and even spectrum, as German MVNO 1&1 has, which chose to participate in Germany's latest spectrum auction and invest in a shared national 5G network.
The choice facing the Commission today is between ensuring Canadians' access to wireless services or protecting corporate profits. It's between fostering healthy market competition or entrenching the incumbent's market power. The obligation of the CRTC here is clear. It must take bold regulatory action to achieve its policy objectives. The Telecommunications Act entrusts the Commission with ensuring that Canadians are provided with competitive wireless services that are responsive to their needs. These networks must be high quality, but also affordable and competitive. The government's 2019 policy direction to the CRTC only further reinforces these objectives. And the government's Broadcasting and Telecommunications Legislative Review Panel identified affordability as a central principle for regulation, while concluding that wholesale competition should become a mandatory condition of forbearance for both wireline and wireless services. Over the course of this hearing, we have heard dramatic threats from some of our national providers. They've threatened to cut investment, they've threatened to delay 5G adoption, and even to fire their own employees. But above all else, we heard them make it crystal clear that their priorities lie only with their shareholders. They have told you that they will not permit their profit margins to drop in the face of greater competition, and instead that Canadians will suffer. You cannot give in to these threats. The path forward is clear. It is time to put Canadians first. We need competition, and we need it now. Full mandated MVNOs are a critical step to addressing the lack of affordability and competition in Canada's wireless market. Thank you for your time today, and we look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation and for making the trip to appear before us. Madame Barin.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for your submissions and your contributions to this process. I would like to start with some questions about the international price comparisons. You mentioned it in your presentation this morning, and you also filed you filed information in your interventions where you compared Canada and the international mobile wireless markets to show that Canada is increasingly falling behind in terms of prices, penetration, and usage relative to international benchmarks. We have had parties in this proceeding, including the national MNOs, questioning the relevance of using international comparisons. And their arguments are that these studies are not comparing similar mobile wireless service plans, and that they're not taking into account socioeconomic factors and things like geography and population density. How do you respond to these criticisms?
So thank you for the question. We think that, of course, you need a bit of caution when you're doing international comparisons, but there's a number of salient points that the international comparisons do illuminate. First of all, when you're starting from a similar baseline and tracking changes over time that are resulting from technological advancements that are international in nature, if Canada's prices are going down at a rate that's slower than other countries, that's a relevant factor that cuts across, that can cut across at least, or an indicator that can cut across other socioeconomic and geographic factors. But aside from that, we've also put in a lot of data in this submission, in our submissions, tracking the comparable amount of investment that Canadian networks providers are putting into our networks. And the geographic challenges that we face are real, but they're not reflected in the amount of the cost that is going into building the networks in Canada. So a number of factors are allowing our networks to build, our providers to build our networks with less investment, with, I guess, comparable levels of investment despite the geographic factors. One is the intensive levels of network sharing that we have in Canada, which allow for a more efficient rollout with less duplication. Another is the well, we've heard that until recently, per usage costs in Canada were very high and were being used by network operators as a way of suppressing usage, right? And we've heard that from Roger's testimony and the changes that they've seen recently once they've started introducing unlimited plans for the users that have adopted those plans. So between those two factors, those are not socioeconomic related factors, but those are very empirical factors that we can track across jurisdictions. And they show very clearly that despite the geographic challenges we have in Canada, the amount of money that's going into the network into building the network does not reflect the very high prices that we're seeing comparatively.
Thank you. And in the course of the proceeding, we had TELUS file a study by Dr. Dupont. You may have seen it. And if you have, I'd like your comments because his study showed that Canadian mobile wireless prices are actually below international benchmarks.
So sorry. So I mean, we could, if you would like, we can file a more detailed response in our final comments.
By undertaking.
But in general, there's two challenges with that study. So one is, so it relied heavily on promotions, which are a factor that should be considered. But it sampled significantly within Canada. So 246 price samples within Canada, whereas 112 price samples for all the other jurisdictions that we're comparing to. And we're doing that type of comparison where the prices are, where you're looking at changes in prices that are changing on like a week-to-week basis almost. You need a comparable level of, you need more samples to begin with. That wasn't our main issue with the pricing comparison, though. However, we think that a more relevant metric is the average revenue per user. That cuts across all promotions and all different types of revenue streams that are coming into in terms of prices and different types of packages, and is a better comparator for international comparisons. In particular, it better accounts for the limited nature of promotions, which is very difficult to calculate when you're doing international comparisons. So if a promo is for 2 months and you're locked into that plan for 24 months, how do you, calculating that becomes very difficult. But the average revenue per user cuts across all of that and provides a metric that is much better in making those types of comparisons.
Thank you. Now, in your May intervention, you spoke about the attempts of new entrants coming into the Canadian market and the fact that the MNOs collectively have approximately 90% of the wireless revenues and subscriber share in Canada. We've heard from other parties, so Bell, for example, argued that in order to get a sense of the competitive impact that new entrants are having in the market, that you need to look not at market share, but at their recent net additions. Can I get your views on that?
Sorry, that's me again. So yes, when you look at percentages of net additions in the last few months, the new entrants' numbers of net additions are comparable to those of the national providers. But net additions for the national providers are not going down. They're going up at comparable rates. And the national providers have a very aggressive head start. So at this rate, it's going to take, decades, if not, if they continue at the same rate, they will never get to comparable levels, to a comparable level where the distribution of market shares is actually changing significantly. But even if they do start adding at a more rapid rate than the national providers, it's still going to it's still not enough, basically.
Okay. Thank you. Now, you mentioned the unlimited plans that were launched in June of last year. And given the recent trends that we've heard about prices decreasing, do you think that there is still a need for regulatory intervention, or given the trend for prices to be decreasing, do you believe that this need has diminished?
We do think there's still a need for regulation. I think we've touched on a few of the points we would make here already, but our central point is that what we've seen in the last year is a start, but not nearly enough. Prices are coming down not just in Canada, but across the world, and a lot of that is technology-driven. And prices in Canada started from a much higher point, and so they actually need to come down much further in order to be comparable, and we're not seeing a drop on that kind of scale as yet. And in terms of the so-called unlimited plans, I think it's important to point out that these are not truly unlimited. We call them throttled plans generally. And because of that, we're not really seeing a massive change in Canadians' use of their data plans. There's been a small uptick, but nothing comparable to what you might expect or comparable to other jurisdictions. The plans remain more expensive than other comparable plans, and they're much less unlimited than what we see in other countries. And although we think it's good that there may be a reduction in sort of bill shock under the new plans, ultimately, for me as a consumer, I'm still going to be trying to keep my phone functional. And the phone does not deliver functional service when it's on the throttled speed. And therefore, I'm going to continue to be restricting my data consumption to much less than it would be otherwise under this system, whereas the more generous plans elsewhere encourage a different kind of using your phone.
Okay, so let me push you on that. What's missing in your view? What would make the market competitive?
I think there are a number of providers, so I think that the unlimited plans are a good example of a type of plan that has been absent from the market but does not address the competition issue. When we saw those plans rolled out, within days, they were very comparable plans across all of the big three providers. So we're still not seeing the variety of plans that we think that MVNOs could bring in that would be reflective of a competitive market, that would offer different types of products to different segments of the population. All of those plans are still looking at the heaviest users. They're not looking at what low-income communities are looking at. They're not looking at what students or seniors or a number of other demographics might be in search of. So I think that when we're looking at a competitive market, you're looking at offerings of different types of plans across different providers. You should be able to see the differentiators when you look at their websites beyond just the branding of those plans or those companies. I think that we need to see more choice. As much as we talk about having a big three, even in many areas, that's not the case for three networks. It's two or one, depending on where you are. And I think that really giving people the choice of the full range of services and types of plans that they would be looking for is indicative of that. I don't know if there's anything you want to add.
Just really briefly, I would also push back on the assumption that these plans are great, and I think they're great that they've appeared in Canada, but the assumption that they reflect a dramatically more robust price drop than our international peers. I don't think we've actually confirmed that yet. It's difficult because they've only been in the market for 6 months, but just to give one example, Australia has a similarly capped unlimited plans that are half the price, have a 1 megabit per second drop off, so they're still more usable once you hit your cap, and come with 100 gigabytes of data before you, or sorry, the same amount of data, for the same amount of data before you hit the cap, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you for that. So now I want to talk about priorities in this proceeding. We've had different parties come to us with their own sets of priorities. For some, it's affordable price. For others, it's been the availability of and quality of the networks in Canada. And others believe that our priority should be a swift rollout of 5G technology. Now, if I were to put that question to you, what would you consider the priority? Is it more coverage? Is it advanced technologies? Is it higher quality? Or is it lower prices?
I'm going to turn this over to Matt in a second, but I think that it's pretty important for us to just make clear that our priority is the needs of people in Canada, getting the services that they need, and that is not being met right now. And so there are ways to tackle that I'll let Matt get at, but I think that we've heard a lot of the needs being profits, we've heard the needs being investment and revenues and dividends, and I just think it's really important to put on the record that our perspective is that the public needs are the ones that are not being met, and there's a variety of ways that I'll turn over to Matt.
Yeah, so I mean, I think you mentioned a number of different priorities, 5G investment, affordability, speeds, and so on, and I think to some degree, different processes may support different areas of this development. We think MVNOs will lead to suitable competition and development of all these criteria. But I think that price is an area that we've heard a lot of concern in our community around recently. When we polled our community, we got 85% of people said that price was a major issue for them. Only 15% said that speed was a major issue. And that lines up with what we've heard in some of the other data presented to this proceeding over the last couple of weeks. I know that the province of BC survey, I think 86% of people said that they thought their data plans, the costs were not reasonable. So we think that price needs to be a high priority, but we also don't think it's a choice. We think that if there's both adequate investment and sufficient market discipline, we can have both things. And we think that there will be many opportunities to develop 5G. Under an MVNO regime.
I would just add, if you're looking for overarching priorities for us in this proceeding, it's affordability and its choice of providers. And we believe that meeting those two criteria of providing more affordability through introducing more choice of providers will actually help hit a lot of those other targets that those other interveners have brought into play.
Okay, so to pick up on the price point, let's talk about low-cost plans. Now, some parties have suggested that the Commission mandate low-cost plans and that they should be made available to a limited segment through means testing. Do you think this is a feasible alternative, and specifically for the Commission to implement such a plan?
So OpenMedia and CIPPIC have also proposed our own version of a low-cost plan. I think the main differentiation for us between the other proposals is that we do not think that these plans should be restricted to low-income users. I think that often what we've seen is that low income refers to low use or low need, and we don't think that's the case. And on the flip side, we don't think that affordability issues only strike those who meet the government's definition of low income. And so what we think that the Commission's role here is, and what we are proposing in our low-cost plan, is to make sure that there is a plan available on all of the Big Three's networks that meets the basic needs of everyone in Canada, regardless of their income level. There are a number of circumstances that can arise where someone might be in need of an affordable plan, but doesn't necessarily meet the government's criteria. You can lose your job. There are a number of things that can come up that might not necessarily check all the boxes that would pass that means test, but don't make you any less in need of those services. And as we do think that this is, as the CRTC does, also an essential service, we want to make sure that people don't have the ability to just technically access, but actually use it.
Okay. And you did mention you proposed a plan that has various elements. Maybe you can describe the plan that you've proposed and also let us know how you came up with the rate and the proposed elements.
So what we are proposing is a plan for 4 gigabytes of data per month for $20. We think that that plan meets the average needs, as we've heard the incumbents refer to as well, that is under 3 gigabytes of data, gives people some flexibility so that they're not going over their month-to-month billing with that bill shock, as Matt referenced earlier. And we do think that that, again, puts that a little bit of aggression on competition and offerings to bring us in line with our international peers. I think when we saw the introduction of the low-cost data-only plans through the previous proceedings, we saw plans that really penalized those affordability users. We saw plans that for twice the price could get you 10 times the data proposed by the incumbents. And so we really think that if we are going to be addressing those affordability needs, we need to be meeting them where the average user is. I'll let maybe Tamir add something on how we came to those exact numbers.
Yeah, just really briefly, the 4 gigabyte for us came from where we think projected average usage should be, average usage. And the 20 to 30 is a reverse engineering from some plans that were in the retail market at some point in time where we prorated how much they were $60 10 gigabyte plans that had appeared at one point in the market, and we basically prorated what it would take to get from 60/10 to 4 gigabytes, basically. If that makes sense.
Makes sense. There were several plans proposed. Some of them were put on the public record, and there were plans that were in the price range of $15 and under. They were prepaid plans. Can you clarify, is the plan that you're proposing a postpaid or a prepaid plan?
We don't have a strong position on this. The comments from some of the other public interveners around how postpaid plans are more consumer friendly and easier to manage and would not necessarily require a credit assessment if you're not pairing it with a phone are, I think, very salient and reflect our views. But I think having them both options available is probably ideal.
Okay. Now, I understand your position that you would like this plan to be broadly available, but we also heard from TELUS about a program called Connecting Families, and I'd like to know if you have any thoughts about this program and whether you believe that a similar approach might be considered in the context of low-income families.
We have heard from, I think, TELUS and Rogers in particular around the plans and the offerings that they are trying to do to meet the needs of low-income people in Canada. Again, I think that we don't think that these are limited to a specific bracket, particularly not one that is identified by a telecommunications company for who they think is in need. We really think that individuals are in the best position to determine what their needs are, what they can afford, and how that matches their lifestyle and the way that they need to use their devices in a wide range of services beyond just what is imposed by the telecom provider. And so that's why we think that the CRTC needs to go beyond the voluntary offerings of the incumbents for a certain segment of the population and actually make sure that it is more broadly available so that people aren't left behind.
Okay. So just to clarify your position then, you do not believe that the Commission needs to mandate a low-income plan, or low-cost, sorry.
We believe that our plan that we have put forward as a low-cost plan should also be available to low-income people in Canada, and that hopefully would meet the needs of low-income Canadians as well as other segments of the population.
Okay. We've heard from many parties that there are low-cost plans available, and that the issue isn't the availability of low-cost plans, but more a question of awareness and promotion of these plans. Do you believe that these arguments have any merit?
No, is the short answer. There is no one that is going to work harder to find a low-cost plan available to them than someone that needs it. And the implication that low-income users are unwilling or unable to do that research is both insulting to people that are working incredibly hard to balance their budgets, but also indicative of the fact that these companies are not widely making those plans available. And if there is a perception issue, I think we really need to be asking why they aren't listed on the front page of their websites. And so I think that to indicate that low-income users or those who are just looking for a plan that meets their needs are simply unable to find it both implies a failure on the part of the incumbents, but also misrepresents those users and just how hard they're struggling, because the more that you need it, the harder you will work to find it.
Okay.
Sorry, just really quick to add that. I think the one of the things that's we think that these plans should be offered on the primary brands, but it's not just that they're not offered on the primary brands. In most instances, they're not even offered on the secondary flanker brand. They're on the, I think some providers have even established new flanker brands recently, and they're offered on those lowest tier flanker brands. So I think that doesn't help with the wide availability and adoption of the plans as well.
Okay. Do you think that the Commission, or that it's appropriate for the Commission to impose a condition of service under Section 24 of the Act that ensures that low-cost plans that are made available by the carriers are promoted and brought to consumers' attention? So this would include things like ensuring that their CSRs are appropriately trained, prominent links or prominent real estate on their websites, and visual display information in their retail outlets.
Would certainly help. I don't know if it addresses, there's also issues with the composition of the plans that they, so some of these plans are low cost and which is great, and they were not available for the Commission, encourage the appearance of these plans. But the data allotments in them, I think part of the problem is that they end up costing more if you have them, and a lot of Canadians would realize that even if they were able to discover them, because you're going to end up hitting the overage before you get through the month, and as we know, the penalties at that point become pretty aggressive. So I think visibility is definitely helpful, and better training and all of that are very important steps to encourage or mandate if the need arises. But I don't know if it solves the problem altogether. If that makes sense? Thanks.
It makes sense. Thank you. So I want to move on now and talk about MVNOs and the risks and benefits. It's been argued that if the Commission were to decide to grant a broad-based MVNO access, that this would increase the risk profile for wireless investments from the carriers. Do you agree with this position?
We don't actually believe this will affect any investments in the wireless market. Ultimately, and I mentioned this during my presentation, like we know from experience, we have seen this, have had this conversation in the past. We had it recently with when wireline access was granted a few years back, and incumbents also threatened that there would be loss in investments. They said there would be more risk in their investments, but in the end, we didn't see that that reduction in investments. We didn't see that much more risk become present once the wholesale wireline access was implemented. So we don't see why it would be any different by mandating MVNOs in the wireless sector. And in fact, we think it might actually help reduce duplication of 5G infrastructure nationally, which might actually help with the development of 5G infrastructure overall. Do you have anything to add?
Well, so I see. So you believe that there actually might be benefits in the sense that there would be a tendency to share networks or network costs.
That's right, and we are already seeing that. There are more network sharing agreements to roll out the 5G implementation, and we think that this will actually be beneficial for companies, especially when we look at communities that may have a local cable company or a local internet company that would actually be willing, or even a local municipality that would be willing to invest in local networks that can connect to those of the incumbents. This would actually help facilitate and prevent network duplication.
Just to add to that, I think one of the challenges that we've had in our facilities-based competition model is that regional players and smaller players have been unable to grab hold of the market or their footprint in the way that the national providers have, having such a decade's head start. And so I think that it's worth noting that even in the worst case position, where the incumbents decide and the big three decide that they're going to slow their 5G rollout, that they're not going to invest as heavily, I think at the end of the day, someone wants to build that network. And I think it will open up the door for other players to maybe catch up a little bit from where we are now. And so we don't believe that this is anything but a threat because we have seen this before time and time again. But we do think that there's an opportunity for other players should that actually come through.
Just really quickly, like in particular, for example, an aggressive competitor like Shaw and or Videotron that would have the opportunity, if they so chose, to focus on rolling out 5G within their area more aggressively, and then acting as an MVNO in other jurisdictions. So it allows for these different types of dynamics that are not likely to take hold and then in that scenario, the incumbents are going to have a choice between investing more in that area to catch up with Shaw or not. And I think I think overall the rollout of this model it'll come down to, so we do have competition challenges in Canada, but there are, I don't think that we should just assume that just because the competition is driving down profits and revenues for the national incumbents, they're going to be able to stop investing in networks, like in new technologies like 5G.
Some of the arguments were less about not investing in 5G, but about the investment trade-offs, among which might be that they stop investing in rural areas or areas that don't have the same business model as a high-density urban area.
So just two quick things on that. So one thing is the Commission does have a framework for ensuring that rural investment happens. And we've seen this on the wireline side, right, where let's remember, first of all, there is this wholesale model in place, but capital costs are much higher and capital intensity as well as capital costs. And we have a model for how to deal with rural. But aside from that, one of our additional proposals that we didn't elaborate in great depth here is that we are also saying that the Commission should recognize in principle wholesale access to spectrum. And we think that if you recognize it, that the need for that in principle, and that will allow a lot of municipalities and other regional type groups in rural to develop their own wireless footprints should the national providers decide to not.
Just have something quick to add. So I actually come from Prince Rupert in BC's North Coast. It is the home to North America's third largest port. Yet my home is 4 minutes away from downtown Prince Rupert, and I only get 1 bar of signal in my home, which also doubles as my office. And for decades, we have been talking about network investments in rural communities and remote communities, but the incumbents still have not been able or have not been willing to make those necessary investments. So ultimately, it's time to try something new. And if the CRTC believes that it is time to bringing more investments to rural communities and remote communities, then it's time we add more regulations and more obligations for these companies to make these investments.
Thank you. So yes, the national there's the national carriers that are investing. We also have currently in Canada regional facilities-based carriers that are operating, and parties have argued that if MVNOs are introduced, that the ones that would be most hard hit would be the regional carriers that are making some of the investments in those rural and more remote communities. What do you think about that?
A lot of the investment in rural areas is being done because those areas need to be served. And we really appreciate the fact that those companies are investing there. They're areas that do not see the same desire for investment as urban areas. It also is difficult because they don't have the same market. And so I think something like this actually provides the opportunity for those providers to also offer MVNOs. If they can sell with a national footprint, if they can reach those urban areas, if they can increase their market share, that is another way for them to raise revenues to help build out their facilities in other areas of the country. Additionally, there still needs to be choice for those customers. And I think too often we view rural and remote Canadians as people who have to settle for what they can get, as though if we get them something, that's good enough. And I think that we really need to be looking, with the government's target for having every person in Canada connected with the high-speed targets by 2030, of what does that look like? Is it you just get what you get? Do you get what we decide to give you? Or are we actually going to try and make sure that you can compete, not just in the fact that you can get online, but you can have the same choice, you can have the same offerings, the same type of plans as people in other areas. And so we definitely want to make sure that companies are still investing in those areas, but we also want to make sure that the people that are receiving those services are able to get online in the exact same way as someone who's in downtown Toronto.
Thank you. Now, in your submission, you submit that if we had a robust MVNO market, that it could spur innovation and cater to market segments that are currently underserved. Are there any areas in the market that you would consider that are being underserved right now that would be the niche markets sought by new MVNO entrants?
So some of that is economic based, right? So lower income groups, even with the emergence of the low cost plans, we think are still being underserved, and the regional MVNOs do cater to a segment of that, but not the fullness of that market segment. But I think part of the innovative potential is actually of MVNOs is that they often create new market segments that don't necessarily exist so we've heard, for example, that in the US, for example, there are MVNOs that create entire customer service infrastructures and tool sets that are directly catered to senior citizens and more elderly populations. I don't see an MNO or even a regional MNO catering their services to that degree to that type of market segment. So, and we heard from ACT a couple of days ago that many individuals in that age group are not comfortable even. So one issue is cost, but it's also convenience and customer service factor. They're not comfortable interacting with the parties that are out there. So there's that type of niche service differentiation, and there's also the innovation factor. We heard the law enforcement, the Halifax law enforcement group, the law enforcement group. I got the wrong. Was it Hamilton? Halton. Sorry. The MVNO that they had described, for example, which is an interesting innovation, which I imagine is a cost-intensive MVNO rollout that's not typical, which creates a technical overlay that is able to triage across different networks to provide the highest quality signal. I would consider that a niche market segment that we wouldn't necessarily assume is out there, but if someone created that, it would create demand for that kind of thing. We also mentioned in our comments, I think Audacity, which is an MVNO in the US, which created the UK, which created a technical overlay that allows for higher quality call signals that most people would not require, but those who have damaged hearing, for example, would like to helps them use phones. So it's that kind of thing. But and there are those offers aren't available in Canada. But it's really the innovation aspect of it is that we don't know allowing for this type of low-cost access creates experimentation, and new types of niche markets get created through innovation by allowing low-cost access at the service level, if that makes sense.
I think the way that the plans in Canada are currently framed are you an unlimited user? Are you a 6 gig, a 4 gig, or a 2 gig user? And every one of those comes with talk and text, with some exceptions. So the idea of who those demographics are right now is defined by the plan offerings, not who you are or what you actually need. And so in some ways, Canada's imagination is really small on this because we haven't even been allowed to think about what it could be or what it could look like. But when we looked at those low-cost data-only plans, the biggest concern that we heard from our community is, if I want data-only, I need even more of it. So what does a data-only plan look like that's truly unlimited but has no talk and text? What about someone who wants to use only talk, doesn't care about text? Do they have to come packaged together? What about the IoT devices that are going to be rolling out that aren't going to need the same types of intensity that maybe streaming video services would, but do need to be connected more frequently? So our imagination needs to grow a lot on this, but I think that looking around at what's happening in other countries, the types of plans that are being offered aren't just for a type of person the way that maybe Statistics Canada would define people, but also the types of devices that we're creating and the way that they might be using the system as well.
Thank you. I just have a couple more questions. On that point, the existence of flanker brands in Canada, do you believe that the flanker brands are ultimately going to be able to address some of those market needs and bring some of that innovation?
No, and I think we heard a really great example from Acorn testifying earlier this week as to why. The frustrations that people have with these companies, and I know there's a lot of discrepancy between how they would try and define if they brand all of their flankers as one of them, as we heard TELUS start to talk about doing, or if they identify them completely separately, as we heard Bell talking about. But in either case, most people in Canada have some understanding that these flanker brands are actually owned by other companies. And so it doesn't get at the core competition issue around the choice of providers. And then I think additionally, when we hear the way that those markets are being segmented, people are getting a poorer quality of service as well. And I think really what we want to make sure is that people are getting the highest quality of service, whatever that might look like to them, as opposed to feeling like they're sacrificing because they are poorer than others. I'll let Tamir add. I know he has a few more thoughts on flanker brands.
Yeah, and then in terms of whether those will ever provide, so the price, so the two parts of that. So in terms of whether those flanker brands are ever going to provide the price discipline aspect, I think that one we can dismiss. They've been around for a while, and the average revenue prices that we do it for our international comparisons obviously incorporate the revenues from those brands as well, and we're still high even with that type of segmentation on the cost side. But when the types of innovation that we're talking about a lot of them are higher risk. So, and that's where innovation comes from, right? Where risks are taken, and the ability to do that with a low cost. You're not going to see that type of experimentation with even a segmented flanker type brand. Also, the last point there is that I lost it. Sorry, I had another one. If it comes to me, I'll mention it later.
Thank you. Okay, I have one last question before I pass it back to the chair and my colleagues. In your oral presentation, you ended by saying, we need competition and we need it now. And I also noted in your oral presentation in paragraph 22, you talked about the Competition Bureau. And you quoted the statistic of 5.5% market share, and you attributed it to MVNOs. Yeah, I believe the Competition Bureau was referring to the share of the market disruptors or the regional facilities-based carriers. And in particular, they had looked at the example of the Quebec market. So my question to you, you are seeking a more competitive market. Does it matter whether that competition is coming from an MVNO model that is a facilities-based one, or whether it's coming from a pure MVNO model?
From our perspective, the facilities-based model, in particular what has been proposed by the Competition Bureau, will not achieve the competition that we're seeking. So we think fundamentally that relying solely on facilities-based competition has not gotten us to where we need to be, and we require MVNOs to be inserted into the market as well to be able to ensure that we can reach those levels of not just the 5.5%, but as we also mentioned in our comments, upwards of 10 or 20% market share for MVNOs, not just for the competition, but for the innovation and the affordability as we've addressed. We wish and would love for the regional providers on facilities-based competition alone to have been the solution. But they haven't been, and they can't do it alone. And we fundamentally do believe that MVNOs can actually help these regional providers as well. But we don't think that the Competition Bureau's model of allowing MVNOs, basically letting Canadians get a taste of what it could be with the intention of only doubling down on the existing strategy, is going to be sufficient. And so we do think that full MVNOs are the only way to introduce that level of competition, but also to give MVNOs a chance to flourish. Because if they are not introduced in the full model that we have proposed, to some way they're being undercut or doomed from the start. And we think that making sure that there are no restrictions around the type of company that you are to be able to come in really brings in not just that risk, but that innovation that Tamir was referencing, to make sure that we do bring in the variety that will help bring in the competition and change the affordability as well.
So, and then, so just to elaborate, so what we were saying there in that example is that it's true that a single MVNO is not likely, or it's rarer for single MVNOs to get to 5.5% market share in specific regions within short periods of time. But collectively, they do get there and well beyond. And that at 5.5% is where you start to see the price discipline that the Competition Bureau outlined. Sorry if that wasn't clear in our oral comments. But in Europe, you see 10 to 20% market share, like pretty much across Europe and every European country, or MVNO market share, and that's pretty consistent. And according to the Competition Bureau's model, that is enough to impose the type of price discipline that is required here to have an impact. But more to the point, I think if we're talking about long-term competition and sustainable competition in Canada, spectrum is an essential input into providing wireless services. And a facilities-based approach to long-term competition in Canada is inherently limited by spectrum. A facilities-based approach also requires significant duplication, which is inefficient. On the wireline side, again, we've gone in the other direction. We understood that it doesn't make sense. It's inefficient. It increases costs across the board to make every single competitor build the last mile between the customer office and the last home. So we've opened up wholesale competition, and it's had its effects, and it's provided for a more efficient type of investment to competition ratio, if that makes sense. With 5G, we think that the propensity for duplication is going to be significantly higher because you do need a lot of last mile equivalent infrastructure. It's a very high density rollout at the last mile. If every single competitor is going to need to have, that high density of 5G rollout around every single tower, that's a lot of duplication. So you're essentially over-investing in a way. So to get to the level of competition that you want. So the regional players, so we think long-term, an MVNO type competitive model is the solution. The last thing I'll say very briefly, sorry, is that the regional MNOs, though, in this model do have a competitive advantage over MVNOs in our view. Being a facilities-based provider in this context, first of all, the MVNOs start with a 15% price hike because it's cost plus, right? So there's already a margin that the MNOs are taking back off, are able to build into their price and roll into profits and beyond the cost of building the network, right? So there's already a differentiator there and an incentive to compete based on facilities, an ability to compete better based on facilities. But the ability to control your network and control the way that your network is set up and rolled out, and to make different quality decisions in terms of what area is something that, what area you're investing in to improve your network is something that MVNOs are dependent on the national, whichever network they're on to provide. So, and there's also branding issues and perception issues as we've seen between different types of brands. So I think there is an ongoing role for regional MNOs in this and other types of facilities-based providers in this new ecosystem that we're recommending. But MVNOs also play a very important role, which is a bit different from those other roles.
Thank you very much. I appreciate all your input and answers to my questions.
Commissioner Levy.
Just a couple of questions. First off, just to continue some of the discussion that you've just had with regard to the possibility of the regional players being net beneficiaries of a full mandated MVNO regime. You say that that 15% margin and the ability to control their own networks would put them in an advantageous position. But that 15% really doesn't compare to the sort of 40% and so forth that we've heard the larger players are able to make on their investment. So how do you make that a compelling argument, not only for the regionals, but for the larger MNOs?
Sorry, so my point there was that and sorry if it wasn't clear, the regional MNOs have a 15% advantage over the MVNOs, if that makes sense? So the margins for MVNOs are usually very slim, and that's true everywhere that they've popped up. MNOs are probably going to be able to hire, based on their control of the facilities, they're usually able to offer slightly higher prices, not usually at the same rate as the national providers, but there's a hierarchy. But because their facilities because they don't have to, their costs are not the cost of building their facilities plus that 15% markup that the MVNOs are paying. Let's say an MVNO has a markup beyond what they paid, so they pay cost plus 15% and then add a 10% markup. To offer the same rate, Shaw would charge whatever their facilities cost plus 25% and would get the entire 25% profit, whereas 15% of the MVNO's profit margins will go to cost. So does that make sense? Like from a map? Okay.
How many MVNOs do you think could emerge, and what do you think that we've talked about the percentage in terms of 10 to 20%, but how do you see that emerging across Canada into rural and remote areas? How many or what do you think the potential is for MVNOs in order to have a real impact on the market?
That's a hard question for us to answer because we have never been able to actually truly test that in Canada to know what that would look like. But I think when you look over the course of the past 2 weeks, it's been a very full 2 weeks filled with a number of interveners who have said that they would like to get started. And that includes providers that are already providing facilities-based services like ICE Wireless. It includes a number of providers who are providing wireline services already who would like to get into the market. And then you have providers who would like to come in and enter as a pure play MVNO. And so I think that how many will actually be able and willing to make that leap and make that investment and flourish in the market is yet to be seen. But I think the fact that there is that much enthusiasm and excitement for offering these types of services really shows us that there's something here. But the specific number, I think we'd be making up a number to try and answer your question as opposed to giving you one.
We'll say that on the wireline side, where we've had, again, this model for a number of years, there are quite a few players, and some of them do have regional market share of 10% collectively. I think they have, I'd have to check, but yeah.
And my final question, going back to your suggested low-cost plan, you're suggesting $20 to $30 monthly price for unlimited talk, text, and 4G, 4 gigabytes of data. Have you built, what would be the margin in that for the provider?
That's difficult to answer.
Well, so how did you arrive at that number?
So we looked at a couple of things. So we looked at, first of all, where the usage should be and what a usable and helpful plan would be, with the calculation that anything below that isn't really going to be responsive to what we're trying to do. In terms of the costing, though, we started off with a retail plan that was being offered by a number of providers, and that for a higher data allotment, and tried to work backward from there to see what would if you try to figure out in a mathematical way how much how much removing 6 gigabytes from that what that would reflect. At the end of the day, I don't want to. It's given the plans that are out there, we suspect that this is doable at a cost, with even a bit of a profit margin. Videotron has a plan like this out in Quebec, as we've heard. It's on their sub-flanker, so it maybe doesn't have the same uptake and visibility as some of the other plans, but it's there, so presumably
Does
they're
it
not
offer
losing
4
money.
gigabytes of data?
I think so, yeah, on Fizz.
The Fizz Mobile plan is 4 gigabytes of data for $25, I believe.
Okay, thank you very much.
I have one general question. I think council may have a question. We talked at the beginning about market not being sufficiently competitive. You pointed to market share numbers, which I understand. I guess a question I have as a regulator is, what's the market share number in your view that we need to meet to reach a determination, or sorry, put it another way, how will we know when we get there in respect of the market being competitive? So numerous parties have pointed out the current shares, which obviously are in excess of 90%. I think you've responded to the question about, but in terms of new ads, most of them, a majority of them are going, and it'll take a long time, I understand, to change the incumbent, if you wish, 90% share. But what's the destination?
I think you're looking for the checkbox you can tick when you know that you've done the job and we've reached there, or the metrics. I think.
Well, more than a checkbox, I mean, I think you'd accept that regulatory intervention is for a purpose.
Of course.
And clearly you're suggesting we need to intervene, and the purpose is to ensure that there is greater choice and better pricing. I accept that. Now tell me how we know when we get there.
So we would put forward that as a start, the CRTC needs to be looking at if the objectives are actually being met, if the policy objectives are being met, which we don't think they are. We think we heard that from the Competition Bureau's own testimony. When we're looking at affordability that is not being met, competition, and in particular, if market power is being leveraged. We also think that beyond just a specific number of market share, that market power itself is useful, but really, when we're looking at penetration rate, usage rates, adoption rates, are these increasing? Can people afford their services? I think is really a critical question that we need to be asking. And in short, can people use it, and how do we compare internationally? And I know that that's not a specific concrete number, but I think that fundamentally we keep hearing from interveners throughout this proceeding that we aren't there, that there are issues where market power is being used to influence the ability or inability for other players to enter the market. And I think competition really would limit that. If we're seeing competition, we're not seeing that use of market power. But additionally, that the Section 7 objectives would be met across the board.
Thank you. One last one, and I do want to probe a little bit about the questions about the impact on the regional competitors. You've said several times you think this could be good for them. I'm not sure if, based on the evidence we've heard and their submissions, they would agree. But in particular, I'll give you an example just from the last discussion where we're talking about a service, 4 gig, in the $20 to $30 range. I take your point about current offering from Videotron. But Mr. Bragg from Eastlink was here, and we asked him what his lowest cost service was. It was $30, I believe, if my memory serves me correctly. And when asked if he could offer a service, and it was, I think we put to him a 4 gig service. It might have been 2. I apologize if I have it wrong. He just said no, not out of. He said he could not do that on a cost-based basis, and he's a smaller regional competitor. So just how do you respond to that? I mean, they are clearly performing an important role with respect to the emergence of sustainable competition. But if he can't afford that, isn't the impact of MVNOs going to be strongly felt in those areas?
So the first thing is that our plan is not proposing that Eastlink or like should we have to do that. Our plan is proposing that this should be for the national providers. And we think and still believe that the other plans will begin to differentiate providers in the market, including providers such as Eastlink. I don't know if you want to add. I can see.
So, sorry, to your point, and I think this, Commissioner Levy, you were trying to get at this as well. Yeah, their costs may be higher than the incumbents, so there may be some trust there. But to the regional providers or MNOs that we were specifically referring to were the same ones that I think the Competition Bureau had in mind when in their analysis, which is basically Shaw and Shaw and Videotron. In terms of the broader market competitive dynamics, Mr. Bragg seemed very averse to taking advantage of an MVNO model should it be mandated, but I think that a lot of smaller regional entities like Bragg would actually have a lot of opportunities to leverage their existing experience to branch out into other areas. This is not a categorical statement across all small regional current competitors, but Shaw and Videotron as well will have benefits from this. In addition to the competitive challenges that they will have on one end from MVNOs, they will also have benefits in the sense that they will be able to enter markets that they're not in right now because they don't have spectrum, and compete as MVNOs in those markets while still competing as an MNO in their home footprint. So there is, I think what we were saying was not that this is potentially necessarily the greatest thing, a great benefit to these types of competitors, but more that they have a role to play in this ecosystem, if that makes sense, and some benefits as well.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Commission Counsel.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So the plan that you've proposed, that the Commission mandate the national providers to provide, some parties have suggested that in order to do something like that, the Commission would need to reassert its powers under Sections 25 and 27 of the Act. To confirm, is that your view as well?
We think you do it under 24 and 24.1, especially because it is it's not, we don't see it as, because of the nature, the animating purpose behind it, even if it's not limited to low-income parties, it's low-income participants. It's seeking to address a challenge for low-income participants, so we think that that type of requirement can go under 24. But we also do think that if this is your next question, that if you were to reassert, deforbear from those powers, you are able to do it based on the data that's on the record with respect to low-income, underserved low-income customers.
I think everyone will appreciate that you correctly anticipated my follow-up question. So that's all from us.
Thank you, Council. Thank you very much. I appreciate your presentation. We appreciate your presentation and your responses to our many questions. That almost brings us to a close. Madame Secretary, avant de clore cette audience publique, je voudrais prendre un moment pour remercier les nombreuses personnes qui ont contribué à la rendre possible. Et mon nom et au nom de mes collègues du Conseil, permettez-moi de remercier les intervenants qui ont participé à cette audience, que ce soit par écrit ou en personne, ainsi que les nombreux Canadiens qui ont fait par leurs commentaires dans le cadre de la consultation publique et de sondage. I want to reiterate that this is a significant proceeding for Canadians, for service providers, and for competitors. Our aim is to ensure that the regulatory framework fosters an environment that provides sustainable competition, continued investment in high-quality networks, and importantly, better prices and innovative services for consumers. We look forward to reviewing all of the evidence on the public record. Thank you again to all those who took the time to provide their input on the state of the mobile wireless market in Canada. Your views are important to us. Je tiens également à remercier toutes les personnes qui ont contribué à l'organisation et la réalisation de cette audience publique, le sténographe, les interprètes et bien sûr le personnel du Conseil. Merci pour votre excellent travail. Finally, I would like to take this opportunity to remind intervening parties they have until March 10th of this year to file their undertakings, given that the Commission is still considering procedural requests filed by CNOC and TELUS. The March 23rd, 2020 deadline to file final comments is suspended. The Commission will confirm the precise filing date when it disposes of these requests. Je souhaite vous remercier tout une fois du plus pour votre participation. I thank everyone once again for their participation. I bring the hearing to a close. Bon après-midi. Good afternoon, everyone. Merci.